Well, greetings. Here we are again on the first Wednesday of October, our ninth season that we've gotten together for our first Wednesdays. And you're here to interact with one another and great minds around you. So it's going to be a great talk tonight. So for the next 8 months, you'll be seeing on the first Wednesday of the month some great talks. Next month, we'll have former Marine Tyler Boudreau, who'll be speaking about his book, Packing Inferno, and that reflects on PTSD and a concept that he's come up with called moral injury. December 3rd, for a completely different change of pace, the costumes of Downton Abbey. Middlebury College artist-in-resident Jewel Emerson discusses the fashions worn by Letty Mary and her family in the popular PBS series, which I think begins for another season in January, so you get primed for that. So I'd just like to say a few words about sponsors and funders. This series, in all locations, is sponsored by the Vermont Humanities Council. And let's have a great round of applause for the council. We have two of the board members here tonight, Carol Gaddis sitting in the rear, and Mary Ellen Bixby, she's over on this side. And really need to thank Jack and Mary Ellen Bixby for underwriting tonight's talk. And they're great council supporters and library supporters. Round of applause. The major organization that helps recruit local funders is the Friends of the Library, and Mary I had this nice little PowerPoint going before and displayed all of our local sponsors, which includes Downs Racklin Martin, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Vermont Country Store, New Chapter, Wyndham Rolls Affairs Council, and new to this year, the Brattleboro Camera Club, because there'll be a talk on photography in the spring. And then the Vermont Department of Libraries adds to the pot, and we thank them as well. So, Katherine Paterson, she's been here before and at the Literary Festival, is the author of more than 30 books, including 16 novels for children and young people. She has twice won the Newbury Medal for Bridge to Terabithia in 1978 and Jacob Have I Loved in 1981. The Master Puppeteer won the National Book Award in 1977, and The Great Gilly Hopkins won the National Book Award in 1979, and was also a Newbery Honor Book, and the recipient of the Christopher Award. So that's 2 National Book Awards, 2 Newbery Medals. That doesn't happen too frequently, if at all. For the body of her work, she received the Hans Christian Andersen Award in 1998, the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award in 2006, and the S.K. Neustadt Award in 2007. In 2000, the Library of Congress named her a living legend. Her book, Stories of My Life, is due out in October 14th of 2014, which is like in a couple of weeks. Well, we'll be looking for that one. Patterson is the Vice President of the National Children's Book and Literary Alliance and is a member of the Board of Trustees for the Vermont College of Fine Arts. She's also an honorary lifetime member of the International Board of Books for Young People and is an Alita Cuts Lifetime Member of the U.S. Section. She served as the 2010-2011 National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. In 2001, she received the Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts from the state of Vermont, where she has lived for nearly 30 years, and she currently lives in Montpelier, but she's visiting Brattleboro tonight. Please welcome Katherine Paterson.
Well, it's nice to be in Brattleboro again, and to have such a warm welcome from so many of you. I'm slightly amazed. I remember very well when I was here, and Jerry reminded me it was in 2010, because we were talking about immigration and asked how many people in the audience were, grandparents and so forth. There were how many people in the audience who were descendants from the Mayflower? I mean, I thought, how many places in the world would you go and have that many Mayflower descendants in one room? I couldn't believe it. I'm going to be talking about reading mostly, and because I think that the world needs readers now more than it has ever needed it, because the reading is quite a special process that other processes don't. Oh, aren't you kind? Thank you very much.
Watch your knees.
I'll watch my knees. When I'm talking with young readers, someone nearly always asks, when did you know you were going to be a writer? I look at the 10 or 11-year-old asking the question, and I feel sure that he or she already knows that he is a writer. I answer by asking the class if they would like to hear my first published work. I hope I didn't repeat my first published work when I was here before. And they nearly always say yes, so I proceed to recite it. Pat, 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 there is the rat. Where is the cat? Pat, pat, pat. This was published in the Shanghai American School newspaper when I was 7 years old, and right beside is a letter from the teacher that says the second grader's work is not up to our usual standards this week. So my first published work was published alongside my first critical review. Did I know when I was 7 that I was going to be a writer? Of course not. Did anyone note that I was showing early promise? Not a soul. And none of us, including me, would blame them one bit for failing to encourage me based on what they read. But something must have happened. Even I can tell that my work has improved over the last 70 years. So what did happen between the publication of Pat, Pat, Pat and our celebration of books and reading and everything in Brattleboro? I have a one-word answer to that question: reading. It started before I was born. My mother was already in the habit of reading to my older brother and sister when I arrived. And when I arrived, I was included in that magic time. I can still almost recite by heart James, James, Morrison, Morrison, Witherby, George Dupree. Took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. And to my glee, peppered with a sprinkle of anxiety, was the mother who proved to be the disobedient one, not the responsible 3-year-old. I could go on with my childhood delights, which, when I had my own 4 children, I loved to reread. 5 of us gathered on the family bed, double bed, Lynn and Mary on each side of me, and John and David either end so they couldn't poke each other. In addition to my childhood favorites, there were new, quite wonderful books available by then. I can't remember how many times we read Charlotte's Web, but I do know that each time we approached the end, John would say, "Don't cry, Mom, you ruin it when you cry." But of course, by the time we got to page 78, I was weeping uncontrollably and would have to hand the book over for a child to finish. Between those 2 scenes of mother's reading, there were the years when I read on my own. Because I moved so often and was thought in each new location to be quite strange by my classmates. Often my closest friends during my school years were the ones that I met in books. The friends I found in books not only helped me to understand myself better, but made it possible for me to come to understand and reach out to others. I remember how comforted I was reading The Secret Garden. Here was another child in exile from the land in which she had been born. Mary Lennox was so like me. She was terribly lonely and had a fearful temper. But as imperfect and unlovable as she was given the key to a secret garden. When I'm asked what my goal as a writer might be, my answer is this: I want to write a book that will do for a child what The Secret Garden did for me more than 70 years ago. The summer that I was 16 years old, I, who was born in China, was rooming with a friend, Mary, who was born in Africa. One night after the workday was over, Mary began to read aloud to me from Alan Paton's novel, Cry, the Beloved Country. At first, it was just the sound of Mary's Africa-haunted voice caressing the beauty of Peyton's language that kept me wide awake and enthralled. But gradually, chapter by chapter, the beauty told me of unspeakable oppression and tragedy that was South Africa's story for too many years. I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but suddenly one night the book came alive for me in a new way. I saw for the first time that the tragedy of South Africa was the tragedy of the American South, where I lived, and where I had been blind to the oppression from which I, as a white person, had been exempt. I began to cry, sob rather, for my own thoughtless sins and the sins of my people. I look back on those tears as a turning point in my young life. I did not leave all my sins and fears on that wet pillow, but I know my life began to change that night because of a book. My reading life was much richer those days than my writing life. I can remember a fragment of a poem I wrote that same year that I read, Cry the Beloved Country. It began with these lines: I am youth, standing at the crossroads of eternity. Which path shall I take? You'll be relieved to know that I cannot remember another word of this poem, and that in the many moves I've made since 1949, it has been safely lost and will, I profoundly hope, never turn up to torture posterity. Indeed, I really hadn't thought of youth and at the crossroads, as I think that poem was called, for many years. One does indeed try to block it out when a writer seems to show so little in the way of early promise. But I am often reminded that teenagers today are so involved in tweeting and posting and texting that they don't lift their heads to see oncoming traffic, much less to see that there are crossroads ahead and meaningful decisions that need to be faced and attended to. At a conference on technology and literature, I was asked to address the topic, what is literature for, anyway? The fact that we ask such a question means, for those of us who care about books for the young, that we've moved from the golden age of children's literature into an age of confusion. And this confusion for writers, and even more for publishers, makes it hard to withstand the gale winds of technology and merchandising, which are rapidly blowing us down a path we may come to regret and may not be able to return from. But as challenged as we are by the confusion of our own age, I think it's probably a good idea for us to realize that we are not the first generation to fear the changes that seem to engulf us. Plato, lest we forget, argued in the dialogues of Socrates that if people learned to read and write, poetry would disappear. For it was only in the oral tradition that poetry could be preserved. I was made dramatically aware of this earlier crisis at the crossroads in 1995 when my husband and I went to the island nation of Fiji to be a part of a conference of Southeast Asian teachers. I worried excessively about the speech I was supposed to give. But when I'd mention my anxiety to other people, they'd poo-poo it. You don't understand, I'd say. These teachers don't even have pencils and paper for their classrooms, much less books. What can I say to them? Just tell them stories, someone said. But my stories tend to be about books, I'd say, mostly my own books, which there's very little possibility these teachers have even seen. It didn't help that the first major speaker was a Fijian professor at the University of the South Pacific who spoke on the dangers of literacy. Quoting Plato's dialogues, he argued eloquently that the rise of reading was destroying poetry and the oral tradition from which it rose. Once people began to read, he said, they would no longer keep in memory the poetry, the stories, the wisdom of their tradition. Of course, the fallacy in his argument lay in the fact that if he himself had been unable to read, he could not have made the argument from Plato. But nevertheless, I was not comforted. What were these several hundred people with their beautiful sarongs and wise brown faces going to make of a speech by a pale American who had spent much of her early life nose to page and much of her later life fingers to keyboard. Fortunately, my speech came late in the week after I'd gotten to know many of the folks in the audience. I'd gone every noon to the storytelling sessions and sat as entranced as a child, listening to stories from island nations with exotic names I had never heard before. I saw homemade books made out of old newspapers covered with white paint, so text and pictures could be painted boldly on the newsprint in a size that 50 children in a village school could see so that they could read along. As I spoke to these teachers from whom I'd already learned so much, telling them as I had to stories about books they had never heard of, I felt something I could not describe. A powerful sensation from the audience that pulled from me what I knew was one of the best speeches, or maybe the best speech I had ever made. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I sat down afterward, nearly overwhelmed. My husband had felt it too. We just looked at each other with dazed expressions on our faces. Later, we tried to analyze what had occurred. And this is what we decided. I had never spoken to an audience before who, having grown up in the oral tradition, truly knew how to listen. The thing that was happening in that open-air auditorium that morning was listening. The listening was so focused, so powerful, that it was palpable. When Western civilization made the decision to set down in writing the treasures of literature and the scientific imagination, something precious was lost. And something was lost as a people we will never, in all probability, retrieve. The power of corporate memory, and perhaps more importantly, the power to truly listen to the spoken word. Incidentally, I take great hope in the resurgence of storytelling in our country. There's obviously a hunger today among people young and old to listen to the well-told tale, and our public libraries have been at the forefront of this movement. I can't help but believe that Plato would be pleased by that. There was another crisis several millennia later. This was the crisis that occurred in Western civilization when the printing press was invented. Long after it had been invented in China, I have to add, but at last it was invented in the West and came into popular use. On the final Sunday of October every year, we Protestants are reminded of this crisis. On October 31st, Martin Luther, an unknown professor of theology, nailed on the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral a list of 95 objections to the prevailing practices of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, this whole matter might have been quickly hushed up, except for the printing press. Within weeks, copies of the 95 Theses of Luther had spread all over the nation. The printing press also made it possible for the Bible, which heretofore had belonged in gloriously illuminated hand-copied editions in church or monastery, to infiltrate even the humblest of homes. And those printing presses weren't just printing Bibles and religious theses. They were printing the classics of Greece and Rome. Wouldn't Plato have had mixed feelings about that? And of course, trouble ensued. Not only the Protestant Reformation and the splintering of Christendom, but the questioning of the whole social order. For wherever people can read freely and widely, they begin to think and question. And there's nothing the established order dreads more than a thinking, questioning populace. Erasmus, an orphan boy, took the only path out of poverty open to him, becoming a priest. But secretly, he read those forgotten classics. A heathen wrote this to a heathen, he marveled when he read Plato's dialogues. Yet it has justice, sanctity, and truth. I can hardly refrain from saying, Saint Socrates, pray for me. And so the Enlightenment was born. In his perceptive book about books, the Gutenberg Elegies, Sven Berkitz reminds us that with the advent of the printing press and the consequent proliferation of books and reading material, the nature of reading itself changed. Just as poetry changed radically when it was no longer primarily memorized and declaimed, so there was a sea change in the act of reading itself. In the Middle Ages and until about the middle of the 18th century, very few people owned books at all. And the average book owner had very few books: a Bible, a devotional tract or two, perhaps an almanac, all of which were read over and over again. So the act of reading was necessarily intensive. But by the early 19th century, those people who could read were, by and large, reading extensively. In addition to books, all kinds of journals and newspapers were available. So the reader read a page or an item only once, racing to get to the next bit of reading material. In our day, adults who read generally read this way. Although today's pace in relation to the pace of the past century is like that of a fast-forwarded cartoon to a painting on a wall of a cave. There's so much more paper coming into our houses and places of business these days that to glimpse at a page of print is to read. And this is where we who write for children still have the advantage. For the child who loves to read is still willing to take the time to give a book, in Robert Louis Stevenson's felicitous phrase, a just and patient hearing. I increasingly feel a sense of pity toward my fellow writers who spend their lives writing for the speeded up audience of adults. They look at me, I realize, with a patronizing air, I who write only for the young. But I don't know many of them who have readers who will read their novels over and over again, who will create their own terabithias to play out endless repetitions of beloved passages. These are the readers who tell the writer things about her story that she didn't know herself until a reader revealed them to her. A fifth grade boy asked me once in a school visit, "Did you name Jesse Aarons after Jesse Owens?" Of course I had. A young boy who wants to be the fastest runner in the fifth grade has a name that sounds almost exactly like that of one of the greatest runners of all time. Of course I'd named my Jesse after the great one, but I didn't know it until an African-American child who was also an intensive reader asked me the question. Many parents and other adults seem to have forgotten that children who read are, by and large, like the intensive readers of another century. "Oh, I know he likes that book, but why buy it for him? He's already read it," they say in the bookstore. But that is exactly when the child should own the book, if he or she can read and reread it and treasure it and pass it down to their own children in time. But even adults who are readers are unaware of this. The communications revolution, which began with the printing press, has speeded up to the extent that once more we have a crisis at the crossroads. Sven Berkitz warns that the great danger in this particular crisis is that most people are oblivious to it. You mentioned your concern with what television, video, computers, the internet, the World Wide Web, not to mention Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, are doing to ability to read intensively and contemplate what we have read, and you are dismissed as a Luddite. But there's a great danger in this shallow approach to knowledge. Remember what happened in the wake of the Boston Marathon tragedy? Innocent people were accused and convicted on social media. Even when not downright false, media most often provides us with a smattering of data, which is an ocean broad and an inch deep. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. Their shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. The Pierian spring, incidentally, for those of you whose memory of mythology, not to mention Alexander Pope, is as faulty as mine, is the Macedonian spring from which the Muses drank. In other words, the source of inspiration for the arts and sciences of ancient days. where we should be drinking deeply or not at all. There was a powerful article some years ago in Harper's Magazine by Earl Shorris entitled, "Liberal Education as a Weapon in the Hands of the Restless Poor." Mr. Shorris tells how he set out to write a book about poverty and ended up writing quite a different book from the one he had intended. The poor themselves, he writes in explanation, led me in directions I could not have imagined, especially the one that came out of a conversation in a maximum security prison for women. In the prison, Shorris met an African-American woman called Nisi, who was a high school dropout. Nisi had, in her years of incarceration, not only finished high school, but had also begun college. Her special love was philosophy. When Shorris asked a group of women in the prison, "Why do you think people are poor?" the conversation centered around the abuse of women, until Nisi, with something of a sneer on her face, broke in. "You've got to begin with the children," she said. "And the way you do that, Earl, is by taking them downtown to plays, museums, concerts, lectures, where they can learn the moral life of downtown." At first, Shorris didn't understand what Nisi was getting at, but as she explained it further, he realized what she was saying. If the political life was the way out of poverty, the humanities provided an entrance to reflection and the political life. And so with Nisi as his educational consultant, Shorris organized a School of the Humanities for the poor, believing what Nisi believed and the University of Chicago's Robert Hutchins had preached, that the best education for the best is the best education for all. The project was funded by the baseball player Roberto Clemente. And I can't stop without telling you a bit more about what happened in Shorris's class in the humanities, which incidentally I checked on the internet. You can find out some things on the internet, and it's still in operation. Shorris's first attempt to recruit students for the school was a total failure. He was urged to aim lower, but he refused. Instead, he tried a different approach. "You've been cheated," he said to a group of potential students in the Bronx. "Rich people learn the humanities. You didn't. The humanities are a foundation for getting along in the world, for thinking." He explained to them Thucydides's idea of politics. "Rich people," he went on, "know politics in that sense. They know how to negotiate instead of using force." He got 50 applicants for the 30 positions in the course, which included philosophy, poetry, art history, logic, rhetoric, and American history, all taught at the highest university level by eminently qualified professionals. It was Nisi who told Shorris how to begin his first class. When he told her he was going to teach moral philosophy, she asked him what that would include. He told her that they would begin with Plato, his Apology, a little of the Crito, a few pages of the Phaedo, then they'd read Aristotle's Ethics and Thucydides, particularly Pericles' funeral oration, and end with Antigone. "There's something missing," said Nisi, the former addict and HIV-positive prisoner. "And what's that?" asked Shorris. "Plato's allegory of the cave. The ghetto is the cave. Education is the light. Poor people can understand that," she said. And so the course began. There were losses along the way, but 16 of the original 30 graduated from a course as tough as any they would have taken at one of our Ivy League universities. These students recognized that the humanities were the door to a different quality of life, and they were willing to work like the Greeks of old to get through that door. Now, I contend that Earl Shorris's course couldn't have been taught by traipsing through Wikipedia. It took intensive reading of difficult text. Reading in this fashion is, simply put, hard work. It demands not merely the skill to decode, it demands time and thought It demands reflection. And out of this reflection comes wisdom. And wisdom, I fear, is in short supply in our society. Well, back to our own crisis, that of technology supplanting the written word. It's not unrelated to all I've been saying. It's been my experience that I speak in schools and hear from young readers that there are still intensive readers among our children. But for them, a more frightening crisis than technology looms. While computer capacity expands unbelievably, the books that children who read intensively will want to read 18 times and reflect upon and pass down to their own children are rapidly going out of print. There's no lack of books, but these are, for the most part, books they will be pleased to read once and pass on. It is certainly all right for children to have books that they will read only once. It develops both fluency in reading and the habit of reaching for a book instead of a remote. But how can we be content to give children only the books that will be raced through and deny them the books that they might return to over and over again, the books that will shape their thinking and change their lives? If there's a single chorus I've heard over and over again, it is the line, "I don't care what my children read as long as they're reading." I'm not going to argue with certain elements of that statement. As I said earlier, there's value in books or periodicals or train tables or the sports page, simply in their ability to hook young readers into the pleasures of reading. For let's not get confused here. Without pleasure, the reading experience is a mighty dry desert. But there is a deep pleasure that can be experienced only in intensive reading of a rich book, which I do not want my grandchildren to miss. And they will have this pleasure only if they do the harder work of reading books that matter. And it matters to society, to the world, to the future of society in the world, if my grandchildren are given the chance and take the opportunity to pierce the glitzy facade of our age and enter into conversation with the wisdom of our race. I'm going to call my friend Walter, although that's not his real name. Walter began life in a family of modest means in a city on the East Coast. Father, mother, then 2 younger brothers. Walter was a lively child, and he was less enchanted with school, but somehow he scraped through the boring days with a minimum of effort. Life may not have been wonderful for Walter, but it was okay. It was normal. Then suddenly one day, Walter's life turned upside down. His father walked out, leaving his mother with no money and 3 small boys to care for. It was a time when the job market was flooded with veterans returning from World War II. Women who had worked to support the war effort left their jobs and went home to be the perfect housewives. But Walter's mother had to go to work. There was, of course, no child care system in place. Proper stay-at-home mothers didn't require that. Nor was there any government effort in place to track down deadbeat fathers and force them to pay child support. It isn't hard for me to imagine what Walter's mother went through working at whatever job she could find, worrying all day about what her 3 little boys were doing, worrying all night about how she was going to feed them and clothe them and keep a roof over their heads. As summer approached, her worry increased. Even though the city streets might have been less dangerous in the 50s than they have become, she was a good and caring mother, and she didn't want her children running loose all day long. So when she heard about a farm out from town where the farmer took children in for the summer to give them 3 months of fresh air and good food at no cost, the children would be expected to help out with the chores, but they'd want to, wouldn't they? When she heard about this opportunity, she jumped at the chance. As soon as school was out, Walter and his 2 little brothers went to spend an idyllic summer in the country. You're already smelling trouble. The farmer was a stern taskmaster. He expected the children to work, and to work very hard. Quite soon, Walter's lively, not to say rebellious nature landed him in trouble. Punishment was called for. And punishment, the farmer decreed, was to be locked up alone in the attic of the old farmhouse. Now we imagine an angry, homesick, apprehensive child climbing the dark staircase, hearing the door at the bottom slam shut and the key turn in the lock. It is summer, so there's still a little light coming from the small window. I don't know if Walter is crying, but if he is, it's probably tears of anger. But eventually, like any prisoner, begins to look about his prison. And he sees that he is not alone. The farmer has also exiled to the attic Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, Mark Twain and Robert Louis Stevenson, Harriet Beecher Stowe and John Milton. Walter takes down a dusty volume, carries it to the window, and begins to read. During the rest of that otherwise dreadful summer, Walter contrived to get himself punished on a regular basis. But by the next time he was exiled to the attic, he had managed to secure a flashlight for himself so that his reading would not have to stop when the sun set. He went back to the city and to school. School continued to bore him, and he was never more than an indifferent student. Yet at the same time his teachers were writing him off, Walter was hungrily reading everything he could get his hands on. During those nights in the attic, the world had opened up for him. He had learned that books could stretch his mind and heart as nothing else and no one else had ever done before. He could not get enough. Those in authority were quite surprised when Walter, who had exhibited no academic ambition in high school, opted to take the scholastic aptitude test. When the SAT scores came out, Walter was called into the office. He must have cheated. There was no other explanation for his phenomenal score. He would have to take the test again, but this time he would be doing so under carefully monitored conditions. Walter repeated the test with the teacher standing over his shoulder and again pulled down an astounding score. Walter graduated from college and took a master's degree in business from Harvard University. He became an innovative and successful businessman, and more importantly, a devoted husband, father, and grandfather, a man not only of intelligence, but of wisdom, compassion, and delightful good humor. Despite a full and busy life, Walter still reads widely and voraciously. Now imagine for me an alternative scenario. Walter climbs the stairs to the attic and finds neatly stacked by the window a dozen booklets of standardized tests and 2 nicely sharpened number 2 pencils. Even if out of boredom he had scribbled in every likely slot, would those tests have enlarged his mind and spirit the way those books did? Or fast forward to our own time. Suppose he had found there a computer with a speedy internet connection. Yes, he might have learned more about the world outside that attic, but he might also have found dark sights persuading him that violence was the way to deal with the hurt and anger of his young soul. I'm very grateful there were books in Walter's attic because, as his wife says, books saved him. I could tell you story after story tonight about lives transformed by something they have read, but those lives could not know the power of reading if books were not available to them. It was the public libraries of America that transformed the immigrants of the previous century into productive citizens. We think of the lady holding up the torch in New York Harbor as the symbol of liberty, but a more accurate symbol is the librarian wielding the date due stamp in the public library. Still today, the public libraries of our country, which make available the wealth of humanity's wisdom to everyone, are the envy of the world. Make no mistake about it, libraries and trained librarians are more needed today than they have ever been. At a conference for new adult readers, a student interrupted the proceedings to say to her fellow new readers, Don't be afraid to go into the library. It might look scary, but it's filled with all kinds of books, and you can check out any book you want and take it home and read it. And there are really nice people there who will help you. Obviously, I love libraries. And so I'm going to close tonight with a tribute to libraries and those nice people inside who help you by reading a scene from The Same Stuff as Stars that takes place in a library. Thank you, friend. On the green, between the store and the church, there was a tiny house. It was set well back from the other buildings in line with the graveyard, and she hadn't even noticed it the last time they had walked down for groceries. Come on, Bernie, we got to see if it's open. I want to go to the store. Maybe if you're good, we can go after. Now. She ignored him and walked up the path to the little house. Over the door, painted in large black letters, were the words, Elizabeth Fletcher Irwin Memorial Library. The sign was almost bigger than the building. There was a hand-lettered pasteboard card in the window giving the hours, Mon, Wed, Fry, 12 noon to 3 p.m. Today was Monday. She felt sure about that, but she didn't have a watch, so she had no idea if it was noon yet or not. She tried the knob. It turned, and the door opened. They were in luck. A bell tinkled as they walked in. From the back came a strange little voice. Make yourself at home. I'll be right out. The witch in Hansel and Gretel. Angel's heart skipped a beat. She forced a smile at the still belligerent Bernie. See how friendly they are? He shrugged. For a minute, Angel just stood there, barely inside the door, looking around at the shelves of books. It was much tinier than the school library in Burlington, but no use comparing. It was a library. It had books. You want a book about trucks, Bernie? They probably got a book about trucks. She headed for a sign hanging from the ceiling that said children's. No, I hate books about trucks. You don't, you know it. I do too. You don't know what I like and what I don't like. The argument ended abruptly at the sight of a strange, bent-over figure emerging from the curtained doorway in the back wall. Hello, she said, the curve of her back forcing her to twist her face sideways to look at them as she spoke. Bernie shrank against Angel. She put her arm around his shoulder, willing him to keep his mouth shut. I haven't met you before, the woman said. Are you on vacation here? Angel shook her head. We're visiting our grandma, Miss Morgan, up the road. Well, my goodness, I haven't seen Irma Morgan in 100 years. How is she? Surely the woman was teasing about the 100 years. Fine, said Angel. She's more than 100 years old, Bernie whispered, his eyes wide with shock. No. The woman laughed, a cackly laugh. I just mean I haven't seen her in a long time. I used to know her back when we were both schoolgirls. She laughed again. Way back in the olden days when it was my grandmother, the one I was named after, who ran the library. She rubbed her hands on the apron she was wearing. How did she dress herself in the morning? Angel wondered, and tried to picture the little woman pulling clothes over her head and bent back and fastening things. Now, what can I help you with today? She may have asked the question more than once while Angel was staring. Angel's face felt like it was on fire. Grandma thought we might do some cooking while I'm here, and I can't seem to do anything without a book. She laughed apologetically. So I wonder if you have any cookbooks a kid like me could understand. Said the woman, and she started shuffling toward a shelf to her right. She walked at such an angle that her head got to the place before her feet did. What's the matter with her? Bernie was whispering so loudly that the woman must have heard. If so, she pretended she hadn't. Keep your stupid mouth shut for once, Bernie, Angel said in his ear. The woman turned her whole body around to face them. Could you give me a hand here? I'm sorry, I didn't get your names. Angel Morgan, he's Bernie. I'm glad to meet you, Angel. Bernie? She gave a funny little shake of her head in their direction. Everyone calls me Miss Liza. Now, Angel, if you'd be so kind. Angel left Bernie still standing a few steps from the door and hurried over. Close to the deformed body of the librarian, Angel felt like a giant. Like a giant on the outside, anyway. On the inside, she was feeling, well, as though she wanted to reach out her hand and touch the strange little woman's wrinkled cheek. She knows how it feels to have everyone staring at her and whispering behind her back. But it hasn't made her mean. It hasn't even made her pull into a shell. I have some tongs here somewhere, but why don't you just reach up? The librarian waved her crooked arm toward the top shelf and see if you can find what you're looking for. She swiveled her head from one side to the other. There's a stool around here, I know. Angel located the stool and climbed up to survey the shelf. There were at least half a dozen cookbooks. She looked at the titles carefully. Cooking Made Easy. That should do it. She pulled it out. Must have been bought by the librarian's grandmother. The pages were almost yellow. There were no pictures, and the print was teeny. She put it back. One by one, she examined the books. She could feel Bernie's fear from across the room. I'm sorry to be so slow. It's just... No, Miss Liza said. Take all the time you need. Meanwhile, Bernie, is it? Would you like to see some books? Angel waited for Bernie's no, but it didn't come. He was probably still frozen witless. Go on, Bernie. She turned from the cookbooks. Get yourself something to look at. I'm going to be a while. How about if I read you a story? What kind of story would you like? Still no answer from Bernie. He likes trucks, Angel called. I do not, said Bernie. Trucks are stupid, 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 stupid. I know just the story for you, Bernie Morgan, the librarian said. Soon Angel could hear Miss Liza's voice reading. One day, Stanley Q. Stupid had an idea. This was unusual. Calling all stupid, Stanley shouted. Why are they all stupid? Bernie asked. That's their name, said Miss Liza. Mr. Stanley Q. Stupid, his wife Mrs. Stupid, Buster Stupid, Petunia Stupid, and their wonderful dog called... Can you guess what they call their dog, Bernie? Stupid. No, they call their dog Kitty. Kitty stupid, said Bernie, and he laughed right out loud. Angel snatched the newest looking of the cookbooks off the shelf and hurried over to hear the story of the stupids who tried to slide up the banisters and take baths with no water for fear they'd wet their clothes. Mrs. Stupid perched a cat on her head instead of a hat, and Mr. Stupid wore his new socks on his ears. When Bernie saw that picture, he shrieked with laughter. And by the time the Stupids ate their mashed potato sundaes with butterscotch syrup, he was almost rolling on the floor. It's my guess, said Miss Liza, that you like the Stupids. You might want to know that we have more books by Harry Allard and James Marshall. She got up from the child-sized chair she'd been sitting on and found Bernie another book. She twisted her face up toward Angel. And what kind of book would you like, Angel, in addition to your cookbook? Do you have one about stars? Angel asked. Miss Liza smiled, looking nothing at all like a witch. Ah, she said almost to herself, I think we must have a mutual friend. That meant the librarian knew the star man. It only seemed right that she should, both of them being so different from ordinary people. Angel longed to ask the librarian about him, but something kept her quiet. What sort of questions were you supposed to ask about a man you only saw on starry nights and who told you so little about himself? So, thank you very much.
I just wanted to say that I was one of those kids who read and read and read and read. And when I was 9, my father died, and somebody handed me Bridge to Terabithia. And I must have read that book 20 times in that following year. I also remember reading The Great Gilly Hopkins and deciding that I'd be a foster parent someday, and I totally am.
Sure.
I just wanted to let you know that that level of influence happens.
Well, I'm very grateful. And mysterious to me, when I wrote Bridge to Terabithia, I wrote it because my son's best friend, who was a girl, was struck and killed by lightning. And I was trying to make sense out of something that didn't make any sense. And I knew a book had to make sense. Or if I wrote it, it had to make sense. So I began to write the story just to try to make sense out of a tragedy that otherwise made no sense whatsoever. And I thought that probably my editor would not even want to publish it. I mean, it seemed like such a private book. And then when she said she wanted to publish it, I thought, well, nobody who's not named Paterson will understand it because it's so much a family book. And so the response to the book has been, over the years, has been staggering to me. And I realize it's because I have the right readers for that book. They bring their lives to the book and their imaginations and their own griefs. So that together we've made a wonderful book. I didn't do it by myself. Gilly was I intended to write a funny book. And after Bridge to Terabithia, I thought I've got to write one which nobody dies and everybody laughs. And I like funny books. I've got a reasonable sense of humor. I think, I could write a funny book. And I wrote it, and in those days, my husband, who is no longer with us, but he was always my first reader, and nobody saw the book before then, and nobody knew what the book was about, not even him. But we were on vacation at Lake George when I gave him the messy pages to read, and he went off to play tennis. He didn't start reading my book immediately, which would hurt my feelings slightly, but he was on vacation. And I was down at the beach one day, and he didn't come, and he didn't come, and he didn't come, and I saw him coming from a long way away. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell by the way he was walking that something terrible had happened, and I didn't, I said, what happened? What happened? And he said, I've been reading your book. I said, but John, that's my funny book. Well, you gotta fix it. You gotta fix it, he said. And so I began reading it out loud to my children because I was a little bit devastated. My funny book was having this terrible effect. And the children were laughing, and my husband was sitting in the corner crying. But we were making a movie, The Great Gilly Hopkins. I say we because my two sons are very much involved in the making of it. One son wrote the script as he did for Bridge to Terabithia. And we have a wonderful cast. May I tell you the cast? If you've seen The Book Thief, Sophie Nélisse, who played the lead in The Book Thief, is Gilly Hopkins. Kathy Bates is Mamie Trotter. Octavia Spencer is the school teacher. Glenn Close is the grandmother. We have three Academy Award winners in this little family production. And I've seen the early cuts, and please go to see it next February or March when it comes out. I think you will love it. I mean, Kathy Bates just makes me weep because she is such a wonderful trotter, and Sophie is a marvelous Gilly. She said, I wanted to be meaner, but the director said if I was any meaner, nobody would like me. She's pretty mean. Glenn Close is just lovely as a grandmother. Julia Stiles plays Courtney, and she's heartbreaking in that role. I mean, we got a lot of winners in the cast. So, yes, did you have a question? I'm sorry.
Well, I've always really liked reading, and it's always been something that I've wanted to do, and it's one of my favorite things to do. And, well, I wanted to ask you, do you try to make books that make make a really good impression on kids, and that like they remember their whole lives.
Well, of course, you'd like for every book like that you write would be that kind of book. And I must say, when somebody like the woman who spoke earlier talks about having read Bridge to Terabithia when she was a child and still remembering it, you can imagine how good that makes me feel.
I really, really liked when I read Bridge to Terabithia. It wasn't really that long ago, like a few months ago.
Well, come back to me if I'm still alive in 20 years and see if you still remember it. Then I would be really, really happy. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
But this is the kind of reader I was talking about. Now, why would I be envious of somebody who writes for adults, please? Yes.
I was substitute teaching today, so I had a newspaper to look at, or maybe it was a couple of days ago. And they were handing out awards to kids that had read for thousands of minutes over the summer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 9,527 minutes got the first prize, let us say. Whereas, well, they were all in the thousands, the 4 digits.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was wonderful that they were being acknowledged. I read as a child by flashlight. I don't think my parents really forced me under the covers, but it was fun to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I never counted the minutes.
No.
And something felt a little off base to me.
Well, you know, you do want to encourage people to read, but sometimes the books you read the most slowly are the best because you're savoring the book. So then you get less minutes, you know, because you're reading so deeply and intensively.
It takes her 3 hours to read the one book. That counts for the 3 hours. She read for 3 hours, not number of pages she read.
Mhm.
So it does count.
It does count.
My son did the math. My son did the math when he did the class, and he says, "This girl's amazing. She read over 3 hours a day for 80 days in this summer."
That's
to
pretty
reach
good.
that." Yeah.
Well, yeah, yes, that's true. I mean, they weren't counting the number of pages. Some of the contests count how many books you read or how many pages you read. Yeah. So I should pull back a little bit. I think rewarding children for reading. Children should be paying for the privilege.
Have you had a regular writing practice?
Oh boy, I always dread this question. You know, I go to schools and the teachers have all told the kids how real writers write. And they go through all the, of course you keep a journal. No, I don't keep a journal. The only thing I've ever written that looks like a journal is what I've written stuff when I couldn't write what I wanted to write. But I actually destroyed those recently because I've been saying I had asked God to give me a week's notice so I could destroy them all. But I thought maybe, it'd be safer to destroy them when I moved. Because if you read those things, which are the closest I've ever come to writing a journal, you would think I was the most depressed person in the world because I'm just writing because I can't write what I want to write. And I'm just glancing at some of them, and I'm trying to write Greg Gilly Hopkins, which I remember is the most delightful book to write. I'm agonizing over that. Just page after page is, who is she? Where did she come from? What's her problem? I don't think I could ever get this book written. On and on and on. Well, maybe it was helpful at the time. I don't know. It just looks stupid. I did not want my children reading it.
I guess what I meant is, did you have any kind of regular structure?
Yes, I know what you're asking, and I'm avoiding it as best I can. There was no question in my mind what you were asking. Well, there was a time in my life when I had a structure. That was after I started writing when my older son was born, and in just over 4 years I had 4 children. And I was writing, in 5-minute pieces of time when everybody was asleep and I wasn't too tired. So I've always written around interruptions. My best time was when they were all in school and I could go to work, and my dogs always insisted that I go to work. They would stand at the door waiting for me to go, and then they would trot upstairs, and if I hadn't followed them, they'd come back and say it's time to go to work, and then they would just lie there quietly when they finally got me to work. But and in those days, I could work in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I would do all the things that a mother of 4 and so forth needed to get done. But that didn't last very long, because suddenly people thought I should come and talk at their school, or I should be interviewed on the telephone, or I should go to Denver, Colorado and make a speech or something like that, which really interrupted my writing life. So that began just about the time Bridge to Terabithia won the Newbury, when suddenly my life was being interrupted, not so much by having 4 children, but by having people who'd read my books. And I can remember in Norfolk saying to my friends, I really do try to work in the morning, so if you could just wait and call me after 1 o'clock, I'd really appreciate it. The only thing that changed was when I'd answer the phone, they'd say, I know I'm not supposed to call you until after 1 o'clock. But this is so, this will only take a minute. So if you work at home, nobody thinks you work.
Right.
And if you don't know you work, then you won't get any work done. So, I could do pretty well between interruptions. And then my husband retired. And there's somebody else in the house all the time. And of course, that somebody doesn't ever mean to interrupt you, because he's very supportive of your work. But it became more difficult to have a real block of time in which I could work. And then he, in the last several years, he's been very sick. So my main job was taking care of him. So I wrote what I could, and that is the book that's coming out this month. And I swore I'd never write a memoir, and so I keep saying it's not a memoir, and they said, well, what is it? And I said, well, it's Stories of My Life. And they said, well, what's it called? I said, Stories of My Life, which is the dumbest title. I mean, I really had some jazzy titles, but they were all refused by the publisher. So it's Stories of My Life. And it is, indeed, Stories of My Life. It is not a coherent narrative. It's just stories. So, in answer to your question is no, I do not have a proper way to write. And as I tell students when they ask me question after question about what my practice, which is what they've been taught is what all real writers do, I said, let's face it, whatever it is that real writers do, I don't.
Thank you.
It's actually very encouraging to hear that. It's great, because
Well, it doesn't do it by itself. If you don't sit down and do it, it doesn't
Right.
get done. And I know that. And sometimes, because there's so many interruptions, it takes me a lot longer than it would ordinarily. But I've really liked my life, and I wouldn't give anything for all the interruptions, because they've been important, more important than what I wrote, really, to me, personally.
thank you.
Yes.
Hi. Kind of a two-part question. I wondered, do you have an audience in mind as you're writing? Or are you really more kind of just writing the story, and whoever happens to hears it?
Yeah.
And then, if you do have an audience in mind, has that changed from the beginning of your writing career to current day? Do you feel like fundamentally young people have changed and that you're writing for a different group?
No, I really can't write to an audience. I try to listen to the story and see how the story wants to be written. And that's why I have so many different kinds of books. You know, I had somebody say to me, just totally seriously, the person who wrote Of Nightingales, that we could not possibly have written The Great Gilly Hopkins. I wrote both of those books, and they're quite different books, but I was trying to listen to the story, to see how the story, and a story set in 12th century Japan, believe me, it's not going to be sound like a story set in 20th century America. So that's my, what I'm trying to do is write the best and most honest and most beautiful story I know how to write. And of course, not everybody would agree that my stories are all that honest or all that beautiful, but that's what I'm aiming for. And eventually, at some point, I have to realize that there will be somebody else besides me reading this story. But I don't change vocabulary. I don't tailor it with a specific audience in mind. And for heaven's sakes, somebody said, "How do you write for an audience that has a 6-second attention span?" I said, "I don't. There's no way I would write for an audience that had a 6-second attention span."
Hi, could you speak about Liddy and Bread and Roses 2?
I'd love to. What would you like for me to speak about?
Well, they're both historical fiction, and they are great to use in school, but I was just interested, you just said that you don't really write to an audience, but I thought the style was different between the two books, although the topics were at least sometimes similar.
They are quite different, aren't they? Because the characters are quite different. Most of the characters in Bread and Roses 2 are Italian immigrants. In Liddy, they're New England farm girls. And I really, truly loved writing both of those books. I started writing Liddy because I hadn't lived in Vermont very long, and whenever I move, and I've moved a lot in my life, the worst thing for me is not to have any friends in the new place. And I saw in the newspaper an advertisement for a workshop that was going to be given. I can't even remember what city it was in. But it was going to be for looking to the bicentennial of Vermont statehood. And they wanted women to write, or not write, but do whatever their art was that would honor women in the history of Vermont. And so I went because I thought, well, there are going to be a lot of interesting women at this conference, so I might make a friend. And so there was a workshop that was being led by a teacher in whose classroom I'd spoken. And I thought, well, Mary will be nice to me. I'll go to her workshop. That's the way I decided. And one of the other leaders, it was a workshop on primary sources, read letters that Vermont farm girls had written back from Lowell. And chills just went up and down my spine. I said, somebody's got to write a novel about these wonderful young women. And then I made very sure that I did not go to Books in Print to find if anybody else had, because I wanted to do it. And it wasn't that I knew anything about Vermont history. I didn't. I just moved to Vermont. I did. I grew up in southern United States where the Industrial Revolution was the cotton gin. I didn't know about the Industrial Revolution in New England and how it changed lives and what it was all about. So I had a lot of research to do, but it was fascinating research and taught me so much about not only Vermont, but all of New England history. So then Bread and Roses was because I live in Barry, or did until May, lived in Barry. And I saw a picture of the children from the Lawrence strike standing on the steps of the old labor hall. And I thought there's got to be a story behind that picture. And proceeded to find out why they were there. At first I thought the book was going to all take place in Barry, and then I got so fascinated with the strike that I had to start it in Lawrence and move it to Barry halfway when the children moved. But why they are so different, in style and everything, it's just because that's what seemed to work for me.
This is kind of a strange question, I'm afraid, but I've been thinking back to my own family and how my husband and I always read aloud with our children from the time they were born. In fact, when I had my first baby, I was nursing the baby, and my husband would sit there and read something while I was sitting there nursing, because he felt I had enough to do with the nursing, and he could do that. But the kids loved it.
Yes.
And every night we sat down, usually the four of us. I only had two children, but a boy and a girl, and we'd all sit there and read whatever story we're reading. Many of them were yours, others, wonderful things. And I wonder about children today. I rather sense that, I'm not party to what families are doing now, but there are so many distractions. And of course, television and so forth that we didn't have at those early years, because we didn't have a television. But the sense of sitting down at bedtime as a family, it's just precious. I don't see why kids get along, but it is. It's
it
just
really
lived with us
It truly is.
all the time.
And
And both my kids are voracious readers. But they, I just remember one time we were still reading, we read until my son, who was the oldest, went to college, left for college. Well, even then.
it reminds me.
But I do remember reading, one of the book about the swan. The swan is going to get
Trumpet of the Swan.
Trumpet of the Swan. And we were sitting at lunch and up in a cabin up in Vermont, and he said, Mom, he was about 16, and he said, Mom, if that swan's going to get a trumpet, I can't do it. It was just, it was so funny. But The Hobbit we read going through woods.
No, it's magical. I agree. I reminded me of two things. One was my daughter Mary, who was the youngest. All of her older siblings had left home, and she was very, very lonely for her brothers and sister who had left. And one day she was going through all of my sins as a mother. And when you're 16, your mother has a lot of sins, And the whole list. And then she ended up with, and besides, you never read out loud to me anymore. And I thought, this is my child that I gave a copy of War and Peace to, because that's the level at which she was reading at this time. And I thought, if that's my worst sin, then I can remedy that one. but I guess it was not long after that, I saw her curled up in a big chair in the living room, and she was reading, and I, of course, poked my head around to see what it was reading, and she was reading Charlotte's Web. She was 17, maybe 18. And I said, you're reading Charlotte's Web? And she said, this is a great book. Still is, even if you've read War and Peace.
First, I want to comment, and I do read to my kids every night, and a lot of my friends do too.
I hope it was okay tonight.
I told them we're going to have to not read tonight. They're a little disappointed. They're going to go right to bed for school tomorrow. So I have a question about Jacob Have I Loved. I read it when I was a little girl, and I have a sister, and I love that book. And I've recently reread it as an adult, and so now I'm looking at it through a mother's perspective.
Yes.
And I was wondering when you were, I don't know if you have sisters, and when you were writing it, were you thinking about your children, or were you thinking about, what inspired you for that book?
I wrote that book because all of a sudden, I'm always desperate after I finish a book. I think, well, that was a great career while it lasted. Because I think I'll never have another book in me. And I began to suddenly realize that among my friends, perfectly intelligent, lovely people, I was hearing things like, well, of course, Mother always loved him best. Or, if my sister hadn't done something or other to my doll when I was 7 years old, I thought, there are statute of limitations on what your sister does with her. I could not imagine these really intelligent women clinging to these childhood jealousies and unhappiness. I thought, you don't want to live your life that way. Sure. And then I began to think about it, because I've raised on the Bible, and I thought, well, just look at the Bible. Where's all the trouble? It's not between parent and child so much, it's between siblings. Cain kills Abel. Jacob has these two wives who are sisters, and boy, there's trouble between the sisters, right? And Jacob and Esau, Esau wants to kill Jacob, and Jacob steals his birthright. Come on. So I thought, this is a universal theme. I will write about the jealousy between brothers and sisters. And I sat down to write that book, and I was so furious I could not type. And I thought, somebody else's problem, is it? Well, this is very interesting. Why are you having so much trouble here, honey? And as I have often said, writing a novel is a lot cheaper than psychotherapy. So, you can't write about jealousy if you haven't felt it deeply, obviously. And so it was not somebody else's problem. I had three lovely sisters. One, my older sister's no longer with us, but it was buried deeply, but it was right there, ready to come roaring up when I began to stir the pot.
Thank you.
I wanted to say that I really related to your story about Walter.
Uh-huh.
I didn't get locked into in an attic, but I grew up a working class kid, and there weren't many books in the house, and I wandered the streets, and so my attic was the library.
Yeah.
I found the library. And recently I was in a group, and we were talking about values. Where did you get your values? And books all the way. I know I got some from other places, but primarily I can name the characters in books that taught me things when I was a child. So thank you.
Well, it just breaks your heart when politicians and taxpayers think that libraries are expendable. Closing branches so that children can't walk to the library much anymore, or shutting down hours, or getting rid of the trained librarians. This happens in schools all over the country. They're getting rid of the trained librarians, the people who know the books, who know the children, and know which book to give to which child. That is so, so important. And a volunteer, no matter how well-meaning, is not prepared to do that. Even school teachers very often don't know the books. I belong to the National Children's Book and Literacy Alliance, and we know that there are only 2 states in the United States that require a children's literature course of their teachers. Now, a lot of colleges might require the course, but the states do not require it for certification. So you have teachers who would like to encourage children to read but don't know the books. And if there's no librarian there to help the teacher, children are not going to find the books they need. And who's going to buy the books? Who's going to know how to select books? for these children. And I do not believe that just having more computers in the library is going to do what we want done.
I almost cried when you said that you destroyed your quote-unquote journals.
Believe me, you wouldn't have wanted to read them.
I have my great-great-grandmother's journal, and she tells about going to Lowell and working in the
Oh,
mill.
well, that's worth having. Mine weren't. Mine were just moans and groans. Read the books. Forget about the journals.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful, wonderful time.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience.